Hi, welcome to Comparative World Literature 211, the short story form and the status of the end. Um, Before we dive into the material, I wanted to take a minute or two to introduce myself. My name's Dawn Marlin, and I wanted to ask you to please start out this course by reading the syllabus really carefully. I didn't want to spend the first lecture just going over the syllabus, but if you have any questions at all, I want you to know that you can contact me by email and we can set up a phone appointment if you can't make it to campus. And if you can make it to campus, it would be great to meet all of you in person early in the term. The course does take place entirely online, so you're not at all required to come and meet me in person, but it would be a good way to get to know each other more quickly. So there's that. And what else can I tell you? The discussion board is a place that substitutes for, it's a kind of technique that substitutes for an in-class conversation. And there are advantages and disadvantages of online courses, and one of the maybe challenges of an online course is that it could lack the sort of spontaneity that we get in in-class discussions. But it does have really distinct advantages, and the most important is that when you are answering the prompts for the discussion board, whether you're answering a question that I've posed or a question that's been, or comment that's been posed by one of your fellow students, you have the opportunity to actually look back at the material and check passages and be kind of careful and considered in your responses. So that can allow us to be more detailed and have more precise conversations than we might when we're just being energetic and spontaneous. So, there are advantages and disadvantages to both, as I said, and I hope you'll really try and make use of the way that this technology can work for us. So I think I'm going to just dive right into the lecture, which is basically a lecture accompanying a keynote presentation, and then I'll appear again at the very end. And you'll work your way through the syllabus, and each week there will be 2 online lectures, and you'll view those, and there will be assignments associated with each of those lectures. So there will be 2 a week. This is the first one. It's lecture 1A, and then later in the week you'll view lecture 1B. And I'll talk to you soon. There's a debate in genre theory about whether the short story is distinguishable from the novel. Graham Good is one of the theorists who represents the position that it's not possible, because it's really hard to point to essential features that both belong to all the stories that you could think of and are also excluded from all novels. He thinks short fictions are different from novels just because they're shorter. And categories based purely on length, he says, are bound to be arbitrary, because there's no magic number of words which constitutes the maximum for a short story. Exenbaum understands this objection, but he wants to say that the difference in length actually creates differences in kind. The shorter the form, the more important it is that every detail serve the whole. And it's more the case that all the action of the story is directed toward the ending. He says the story gravitates toward maximal unexpectedness of a finale, concentrating around its. According to Exenbaum, it's the ending more than anything else that differentiates short fiction from long. A novel's juggling multiple subplots more than can be contained in a sharp, targeted ending. So novels have to let up slowly as they conclude, whereas stories can end in a surprise or deliver some sort of shock or provide a pointed moment of relief or reveal a new understanding. We would expect then that the short story closes down what theorist D.A. Miller calls the narratable, which means the conflicts, obstacles, problems, and dangers that keep people reading. That's what he means by the production of narrative. Some of the ways he talks about the narratable are abstract. He says, for instance, that disequilibrium is narratable. That's just another way of saying that there's been a disruption of the ordinary world, that things are thrown off balance, and that narratives tend to want to restore balance. When he says that the narratable is deferral, he means that suspense is built when the narrative turns on the answer to a question that's withheld for most of the narration, postponed as long as possible in order to keep the reader engaged. When answers are postponed, the reader doesn't have enough information to be able to decipher or extract meanings. Narratives end when problems are solved, questions or answers are answered, order is restored. Miller wants to show that what looks like closure actually prolongs the narratable. One of his examples is Jane Austen, a British writer publishing in the early 19th century. We should remember that it was a period in which one might argue that gendered expectations for women contributed to repression. The only sort of female desire that was socially acceptable was contained desire, desire focused on the necessity to marry, since women didn't work outside the home and were socially shamed and economically vulnerable if they were spinsters. Miller argues that Austen's novels seem to deny erotic desire, but he points out an interesting logic. Far from extinguishing desire, fear intensifies and prolongs it. The more we tell ourselves we need to avoid something, the more it's constantly on our minds. So endings that purport to shut down desire, if desire is a way to think about what generates a narrative, might actually maintain it, making the ending more ambiguous than it seems. I'll give you an example. So if all the energy in a novel turned on the protagonist's infatuation with the wrong man, wrong because he's dangerous or wrong because he wasn't a good match for some reason, and then out of fear or good judgment, she marries an appropriate man at the end, this resolution of desire doesn't actually make the reader forget the energy that was invested in the original love interest. Miller puts this another way. He says, the narratable is stronger than the closure to which it is opposed in apparent binarity. What he means by this is that there's an apparent opposition between the forces that generate the story and the forces that shut it down. He wants to say that the opposition isn't as strict as it first appears, because what counts as closure doesn't answer all the questions, doesn't put an end to all desire. The narratable is not so easily contained. The very concept of closure seems to deny the questions or problems that generated the narrative are not easily or perfectly solved. There's only an appearance of shutting down or answering all questions or solving all problems. He argues that there's an intrinsic problem in the concept of closure. There aren't. Is this also true of the short story form? Might the ending, one of the main features that ostensibly differentiates short and long fiction by its weight and concentration of all that's preceded, provide less closure than Exenbaum suggests, further eroding the. How does focusing on endings draw our attention to the questions, problems, and imbalances that propel the plot? We'll start today with a very short story by Heinrich von Kleist. I've set up the syllabus chronologically, so you'll have the opportunity to trace some of the developments in the short story form, keeping in mind that there's often a circuitous rather than a linear development, especially since we're not confining ourselves to a single national tradition. Kleist was a German Romantic writer publishing in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. Since this is a course on endings, and since Kleist's own ending was a violent one, I'll just mention it quickly without attempting to derive any meaning from it. Kleist ended his life by enacting a murder-suicide pact. The first story we'll discuss is the very short tale, The Beggar Woman of Locarno, set in Italy, which was typical for many German romantic tales. Let's begin at the beginning by looking at the extremely long, rambling first sentence. In the foothills of the Alps, near Locarno in northern Italy, there used to stand an old castle belonging to an Italian marquis, which can now, when one comes from the direction of St. Gothard Pass, be seen lying in ruins. A castle with high-ceilinged, spacious rooms, in one of which the mistress of the house one day, having taken pity on an old sick woman who had turned up at the door begging, had allowed her to lie down on the floor on some straw they had put there for her. So there's a lot going on in this first sentence, right? It begins by situating the tale in place, but not in time, right? So we see that it's at the foothills of the Alps, near Locarno in northern Italy. So those things are very specific. But it doesn't tell us when this story is taking place. So one of the effects of withholding the time in which the tale is historically situated is that it makes it feel like it's a story that contains a sort of eternal truth, which is a feature of a kind of romanticizing tendency, and it casts the story into the sort of hazy realm of myth. But the specificity, on the other hand, grounds the story, and the contrast between those two sets up a tension between the rationality involved in historical grounding and the irrationality involved in myth-making. There's another contrast here, though, in the first sentence as well, and that's the contrast between high and low. And you can look for a minute to try and find that contrast. It's where, on the one hand, the high ceilings flag the high position of the nobility who live there, and the straw bed on the ground flags the low, weak position of the beggar woman. So these are organizing contrasts in the first sentence, and they set up, I think, two questions. The first is, what sort of rationality or logic will be operating here? And the second is there a relationship between the two sets of oppositions, rational, irrational? Another hint that rationality is a central question in this story is the prominence of the word inexplicable on the second page. It's a word which announces a lack of rational explanation. So one example is, when his own servants began to repeat the strange and inexplicable rumor that a ghost was stalking at midnight. And then, later down on the page, to his horror, he did in fact, on the stroke of the witching hour, hear the inexplicable sounds. And then finally, on the following night, both they and a loyal servant whom they had asked to accompany them heard the very same inexplicable ghostly sounds. So my question to you is whether this announcement is reliable. What's deemed inexplicable by the narrator are the sounds of someone rising from a bed of rustling straw, and the sounds that echo the beggar woman's whole trajectory from straw bed to the back of the stove, from life to death. But from whose point of view are these sounds inexplicable? The first time the word is used, it's in the context of a rumor being circulated about a ghost, and it's inexplicable to the servants who played no part in the beggar woman's death. But the second time it's used, it's the marquis who hears inexplicable sounds at the stroke of midnight. And the third time, it's both the marquis and his mistress who are unable to explain the ghostly sounds. The reader, however, is less mystified, since we've just been told about the event that the haunting echoes. In the fictional world, of course, several years have passed between the woman's death and the haunting, which somewhat helps us to understand why the event might not be foremost What's the logic to the haunting? Let's look back at the description of the initial event, the woman's death. The Marquis angrily ordered the woman to get up from the corner and remove herself to behind the stove. As she rose, the woman's crutch slipped on the polished floor, and she fell dangerously, injuring the lower part of her back. As a result, she collapsed moaning and gasping behind the stove and expired. So is there a crime here? Or does she die of natural causes? The narration makes her death seem like an accident, right? She slips, she falls, and then we're told that her death is the result. So a causal logic is set up from the narrator's point of view. And yet we know that the woman slips as a result of the Marquis's angry order that the woman remove herself. In his view, she's too low to be allowed a bed of straw on the ground. She must remove herself from his sight. The fact that the Marquis finds the haunting inexplicable means that he doesn't see his own transgression against human sympathy or the violence that it brings about. Is he willfully blind? It seems that he forgets because for him, his cruelty was a non-event, a way of treating others based on the principle that noble titles imply virtue or worth, and that those without them are worthless. The haunting contradicts him, insisting that it mattered, that she mattered. It imposes. How does this story end? Again, the narrator suggests that the Marquis dies at his own hands. He says, he set fire to all four corners. But the story nonetheless leaves the impression that somehow, from beyond the grave, the beggar woman is exacting vengeance, as if she were a witch figure from a fairy tale testing the Marquis's own worthiness. There's a sort of wish fulfillment operating in this otherworldly sort of ending. As irrational as it seems, it's as if magic could supply justice when the explanation that the narrator gives us for the Marquis's self-destruction, that he was weary of his life, is not quite plausible, both because of the suddenness of his decision, which makes him appear to be acting under a kind of compulsion, and because of the neatness of the narrative structure of substitution. His bones end up in the same exact spot as the beggar woman's, whose death he caused by his cruel indifference. So there's a contradiction in the ending, which supplies us with two explanations. One is told to us by the narrator, and the other we infer from the symbolic evidence of the bones. And this is a good example of how the narrator and the author in analyzing a short story are not always the same. I would say the narrator is giving us one explanation, and the bones are put there as evidence. The story is focused on the question of human compassion and the act of cruelty which disavows and therefore suspends responsibility. But the symbolic ending supplies an answer. The Marquis is responsible, and we know this because the story turns on poetic justice. The roles are reversed. Whereas the woman was weak and the Marquis was strong, she asserts herself in the end beyond the grave, forcing him to take her place behind the stove. So, are things tied up in the end? Does the end provide closure by meting out poetic justice? Or does the counter-explanation the narrator gives for the Marquis's self-destruction, he was weary of his life, prevent closure? And if it prevents closure, does it do so because there are two competing explanations, which leaves a residue of doubt? Or because perhaps our satisfaction is thwarted because the Marquis never takes responsibility for the transgression? Is the story more or less satisfying, interesting, or tight because of the uncertainty at the end? Or might this uncertainty work to make the story more effective by suggesting that punishment can be imposed from within or from without, and that we can't necessarily control when and how justice will assert itself? Before signing out, I just wanted to remind you that I've posted discussion board prompts, so I'll look forward to conversing with all of you on the discussion board. And then be sure when you're done answering those prompts to move on to the reading that will prepare you for Lecture 1B. And that will be another short story by Kleist, longer than this one, but you'll see some of the same themes reemerge, particularly the theme of the danger of forgetting. So we'll talk later.